Hi there, everyone. I can see we've still got a fair few more people joining as we speak, but as it is now 12:30, I think it's a good time to get started. So, very first and foremost, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this lunchtime. My name's Rachel Murphy. I'm the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So, welcome to existing volunteers. Similarly, welcome to anybody not yet a volunteer with NPMS, but perhaps may be interested, and we may be able to inspire you today. So today's webinar is part of our ongoing programme of webinars, events and workshops for NPMS volunteers. We have a few more running to the end of this year. We have a lovely nature journaling workshop next week. The following week we have a winter trees webinar. So do take a look at any other events coming up. And I'm going to just stop sharing this screen, if the Zoom will allow me, so that I can introduce lovely Joshua, who is joining us today to provide us with the talk today on coastal vegetative shingle. So Josh is a botanical specialist with a huge amount of experience as an ecological consultant, and happily, he's also quite experienced as a trainer with us with NPMS. I think this is your third or fourth training session with us, Josh. So we're super glad to have Josh back, especially talking about this particular habitat type, because I can say that this is actually one of the least recorded and represented habitat type within the NPMS database. So we're really happy to hear a bit more about it and hopefully inspire some more data collection. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Josh. Thanks ever so much.
Hello, thanks very much,
Josh.
Rachel. Brill, hello everyone. My name's Josh. I love plants. And I am a consultant, as Rachel rightly says. More recently, I'm director of my own consultancy, Styles Ecology Limited. And today, we're going to look at a really interesting and globally very rare habitat, which is, of course, coastal vegetated shingle. So first and foremost, what is coastal vegetated shingle as a habitat? Well, the name implies it's a coastal habitat found locally around the coasts of Britain. And it is essentially where shingle, defined as particles with a width of between 2 and 200 millimeters, accumulates above the mean high water mark. So the mean high water mark essentially is where, on average, where you get your high tides. And so on shingle beaches, just above that high water mark, the mean high water mark, you will begin to get vegetation naturally colonizing. And just above your mean high water mark, that is where we're still getting some disturbance. By the sea, we're getting salt spray. And so our vegetation there is what we describe as pioneer vegetation. But it doesn't stop there. When it comes to coastal vegetated shingle, as the vegetation establishes, stabilizes, the sea stops depositing so much shingle, so much stuff. What happens is the vegetation transitions from pioneer vegetation to a more stable community. And so that is essentially what a vegetated shingle beach is. It's a shingle beach that has vegetation on it above that mean high water mark. Really interesting habitat. When it comes to management of vegetated shingle, really, when it comes to other habitats like grasslands, we know that to maintain the vegetation there, we need to manage a grassland, whether it's through cutting, grazing. When it comes to woodlands, we know that woodland management, there are so many different strategies applied. be it coppicing, pollarding, grazing. But shingle beaches really need very, very little management and might only really include things like removing invasive species. They really don't need very much management at all. And another thing, of course, to mention about shingle beaches is they are a very hostile habitat. A really, really hostile habitat indeed. If you think about what a shingle beach is, it is essentially a bunch of rocks where there is a lot of salt spray. Depending where you are on a shingle beach, there's lots of sediment deposition, so you're getting a habitat that's getting churned around a little bit, and there's a generally low availability of fresh water. And so in the summer, when you get really long periods without rain, of course, these are habitats that are subject to desiccation. And so shingle beaches are very hostile habitats, which is a brilliant thing in a way, because what do you get when you get hostile habitats? Think of bogs. There's another hostile habitat. Some bogs permanently wet and they're acidic as pickled onions. And of course, in bogs, you get the same thing in a way as you get on shingle beaches, which is, of course, specialists. Species which are specifically adapted to cope with those incredibly hostile environments. And shingle beaches have a lot of specialists. We're going to talk about some of those plants, vascular plant specialists today. But of course, there are other specialists that you'll find on shingle beaches, invertebrates especially. Really special habitat because they're hostile, because they have lots of specialists that occur there. But as hostile and peculiar as shingle beaches are, there isn't just one kind of shingle beach. They are a really immensely variable habitat with lots of different plants and different plant communities that grow on them depending on a huge range of factors. On a shingle beach, you could have an immensely different pH depending on where you are in the country. If you have, say, shingle that is mostly alkaline, full of chalk or limestone or stuff that is innately alkaline, then the pH is going to be different compared to a beach that's made up of lots of flint or sandstone. So pH can actually have a really significant effect on the kind of vegetation that's able to occur on any given shingle beach. Particle size. Um, your shingle, defined as particles between 2 and 200 millimeters, um, particles that are very big, the spaces in between them and how prone to desiccation they might be, it's going to be very different compared to if those particles that make up your shingle beach are quite small. Or you could have big particles that are infilled with sand. And so particle size, sort of what kind of shingle is on your beach, also is going to have a massive influence on the kind of vegetation that grows there. Depending on how close you are on a shingle beach to water tables or aquifers, that has an impact. Depending on disturbance, whether it's disturbance by the sea, depositing things on your beach, or disturbance by people or other things, that is going to impact the kind of communities of plants that grow on your shingle beach. And lastly, as well, age, how old your shingle is going to influence what is going to be growing there. Older shingle might have had more time to acidify You might find things like heathland on there. You might have scrub on there in older examples of shingle, whereas newer shingle is going to have different vegetation entirely. So, yes, shingle as a habitat, really hostile, but also really variable. As well as being variable, as well as being hostile, it is, of course, a globally amazing, globally rare habitat. And in a global context, it very rarely occurs outside of Europe, Japan, and New Zealand. Britain has a large proportion of the global total when it comes to the amount of vegetated shingle we actually have in the world. And that total in Britain is about 4,800 hectares. It's the most recent estimate. But that has declined and it is declining. So between 1990 2008, for example, there was an estimated 10% decline in the area of vegetated shingle we have left. So variable, hostile, globally rare. And also, one thing I did want to add as well when it comes to vegetated shingle is people often think about what biodiversity can do for us. And of course, vegetated shingle gives us a lot of ecosystem services, which I thought I'd just chuck in briefly as well. Vegetated shingle, really important as a coastal defence, as a flood defence, as a sea defence, which of course is going to be more important in the onset of climate change, in the onset of in the increase of sea levels. So yeah, brilliant. Britain contains about a third of all vegetated shingle in Europe. So just to drive it home, a very immensely rare habitat. And in the context of Britain, which is such a tiny little place, really, actually, for vegetated shingle, we are a global stronghold and a globally important place for vegetated shingle. Of course, as globally rare and important and hostile and variable as shingle is, which we've recognised under various pieces of legislation, we recognise it as a priority habitat under the Natural Environment Rural Communities Act in England, which means that we recognise as a nation that this is a priority habitat for the conservation of biodiversity. It's also recognised under something called the Habitats Directive across Europe, where it's recognised under Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive as a globally important habitat, or at least an important habitat in Europe. As rare and important as shingle beaches are, though, they do remain at massively high risk from a number of different things, from climate change. Increase in sea levels is seriously pushing declines of our vegetated shingle, as well as allied coastal habitats like coastal sand dunes and salt marsh as well. We're losing an immense volume of these habitats thanks to sea level rise already. As well as climate change, sea level rise, we've got things like recreation and beach management, which are further putting these habitats, these amazing, globally important habitats at risk. Disturbance from people, but as well as things like harrowing and beach cleaning, which prevents vegetation establishment, particularly on the south coast, is pushing declines even more. And it's a real risk to coastal vegetated shingle as a habitat. Hard coastal defences like groins and all kinds of other things means that shingle might accumulate more in places with these coastal defences, but actually it causes shifts in in sediment deposition, which means that other parts of the coast might get less shingle and they might erode. And lastly, development. It's still a big risk when it comes to vegetated shingle. This is just one example that I thought I'd post on the right from Shoreham Harbour, which between 2009 and 2015, not even a decade, 6 years, Shoreham Harbour, huge bit of coastline on the south coast, lost about 48% of its coastal vegetated shingle. A lot of that down to development, just like in this picture right here. So yeah, it's amazing, as hostile, as variable, as special as coastal vegetated shingle is, they are still a high risk habitat. But there is some good news. And the good news is about three quarters, 3,200 or thereabouts, out of 4,800 hectares of coastal vegetated shingle lies within specially protected sites for nature conservation. These are legally protected areas, which is a brilliant thing and gives these really special habitats some key legal protections which they desperately need. There are things that are ongoing across shingle beaches in the UK. There's targeted invasive species management. There's targeted reductions in recreational pressure across parts of our coastline where we have shingle beaches. And there's a cessation in things like shingle extraction, in things like harrowing on parts of our coastline, which has allowed for the redevelopment of vegetated shingle. And also, another thing I lastly wanted to mention before we go and talk about some of the species that are found on our shingle beaches. Last thing I want to mention is biodiversity net gain, which people have generally a variable opinion over. But what we have in England, anyway, now, when it comes to biodiversity net gain is when it comes to development, what it does. And we've never really had this before, is it incentivizes developers to avoid highly distinctive habitats like coastal vegetated shingle. And where these habitats are being destroyed for development, just like this one at Shoreham Harbour, it essentially means that we need to, at great expense, recreate areas of coastal vegetated shingle and/or enhance the habitat that we have. So we have things like biodiversity net gain, as well as all of these other things that are ultimately, hopefully, contributing positively towards the conservation of vegetated shingle as a globally important habitat that we have here in Britain. Brilliant. So let's get talking about some of those species that we find on our vegetated shingle. So we'll talk about a few of these and then we will have our little conclusion. Of course, these are all NPMS species. And the first one is beet or sea beet, Beta vulgaris. And this is a beautiful little plant that you will find on shingle beaches, as well as on sort of drift lines and on waste grounds. And it is a sprawling, fleshy perennial. The species that we find on our shingle beaches, which belongs to the subspecies Maritima. There are a couple of other subspecies, but ultimately this plant that we'll find on our shingle beaches, unlike other subspecies, is a sprawling, really heavily branched plant. Unlike subspecies vulgaris, which includes things like beetroot, sugar beet, and all that jazz, which actually look very different to our sea beet. A really green, fleshy perennial, sprawling perennial with these clusters of green flowers which are arranged in these elongated spikes. Really, really brilliant little plant. Flowers July, September, so you might still see some in flower around now, clinging on if you go and look for this plant. Marvelous. Another succulent species, because succulents in plants is often an adaptation for hostile environments that are low in the availability of fresh water. They keep lots of water in their tissues to help avoid desiccation. And this is biting stonecrop, which is a small succulent plant of parched places. We'll find it inland, on walls, and on green roofs and things like that. But around the coast, we'll find it in parched habitats like maritime cliffs, um, sand dunes, as well as shingle beaches. This is a plant that's characterized by its slender, small, and creeping stems. With when it's in flower around summertime, June, July, it has these terminal bright flowers. If you're ever wondering and you want to take the risk and fancy a little nibble, a little taste, it is an incredibly peppery plant, and you will want to spit it out if you're anything like me. Don't like spicy food. So we've had our sea beet, we've had our biting stonecrop. Another plant that we get on our shingle beaches, here's another one. It's bristly oxtongue. Took me about 2 weeks to remember this scientific name, Helminthotheca echioides. And it's so named, bristly oxtongue, because the leaves elongate, they lingulate really a little bit, they're tongue-shaped, and they have lots of bristles on them, bristly hairs. So it's got leaves like a bristly ox's tongue. Um, and this is a plant that is an erect, it's a really tall, upright, biennial, of disturbed ground, including shingle beaches. And it has those elongated leaves that are coated in those stiff, bristle-like hairs. You've got these erect flowering stems that are leafy, as you can see in this right-hand picture here, with flowering heads that sort of branch off from our flowering stems that have erect to patent outer bracts. So what we have in a lot of our dandelion-like sort of yellow flowered daisy family plants are generally flowers that consist of a few different parts. So we have our flowering heads, which have these yellow petal-like things called ligules, which I'm hoping people can see my mouse here. I've got all these petals or ligules that surround, that make up a lot of our flowering head. Below that, we have our inner bracts. These are these green scaly bits that sort of encompass tightly our flowering heads. But as well as those inner bracts, what you'll often find in these yellow daisy relatives are these outer bracts as well, which are these things. And in bristly oxtongue, they are erect to patent, which means that they're upright to patent, patent being flat. So they could be quite flat, they could be a little bit upright. And it has these lovely little erect to patent outer bracts here, which are also bristly. Another quite late flowerer between June and October. Brilliant. Okay. So on to the next B, which is buckshorn plantain, Plantago coronopus. It's not a tall, erect thing like our bristly oxtongue. This is quite a small, tufted plant. And so this here is a small, hairy to glabrous being without hair, perennial plant, unlike our bristly oxtongue, which is biennial, lives 2 years. Here we've got a perennial. And our buckshorn plantain is really a plant of short vegetation, mostly by the sea, but you'll often find it next to roads that are salted as well. Leaves are usually a bit toothed or deeply lobed, so you could have teeth that go right into the leaf, and the leaf is quite divided, or they could just be little teeth on these elongated leaves. The flowers come in spikes which you can see in this picture here. And unlike a lot of flowering plants that are not grasses, sedges, or rushes, this is a plant that's wind pollinated. So compared to, your sea beet, compared to your bristly oxtongue, which really rely on pollinating insects, this is a plant that is really wind pollinated. Flowers generally early summer, around May to July. Brilliant. Okay. Next, we have quite an interesting little plant, which is curl dock, which I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar are familiar with, but this is quite a special one. It's quite a special one because curl dock, although it is as a species very widespread, um, the plant that occurs on shingle beaches and by the coast generally is a little bit different to the plants that we traditionally find inland. So curl dock, as a species, it's an erect perennial plant up to 1 metre with elongated leaves that are distinctly crispy, distinctly crinkled, distinctly curvy, which is where it gets its name from. It's curled. Subspecies Littorius, though, that we find by the coast is a smidgen different to the other plants that we find inland. And if we were to look at an individual fruit, a little one of these segments on these flowering heads of subspecies Littorius, the plant we find by the coast, what we'll find is we'll have these scaly bits, our tepals, which we'll get in our curl dock, but unlike the plants that we find inland, the tubercle, it's like a little bubble, a little bauble on the fruit. The tubercle in our curl dock by the coast is much bigger and much more inflated than plants inland. And the reason for that in our maritime subspecies of curl dock is essentially what this tubercle does is it acts as a life raft so that it can be carried away by the sea and float and be deposited on another shingle beach, on a sandy beach, somewhere by the coast. And so what curl dock has done here, it's adapted to a coastal environment. And this nice little adaptation means that not only is this a plant that's able to survive by the sea, but it's a plant that's able to be easily distributed and dispersed by seawater, which is brilliant. Cool, cool, cool. Okay, so we've had our curl dock, we've got our marram. Marram grass. Now, marram as a grass, most people think grasses look quite similar, but marram is actually, I think, quite distinctive as a grass. It is a really robust, tall species that is strongly rhizomatous, so it's got a creeping rootstock. You'll generally find it on sand dunes, but you can find it on shingle beaches as well, especially if there's a bit of sand that's intermixed with your shingle. Leaves of this plant are really long and very, very stiff. What a lot of grasses do, particularly in hostile environments like sand dunes, like shingle beaches, is they really struggle to get nutrients and create tissue. And so to stop all of that valuable energy going to waste on some wild horse or a cow or whatever, is these are plants that have evolved to incorporate a lot of silica into their tissues. They're really unpalatable to a lot of grazing animals. And so marram is a really stiff-leaved species because it incorporates so much silica into its tissues. And leaves are enrolled as well to minimize water lost to transpiration. So a really tall, robust, and rhizomatous grass with those stiff leaves. When it's in flower, which you can just see here, it has these inflorescences Inflorescence is just a collection of flowers. So it has these flowering heads, these inflorescences, which are compact and straw-coloured, which you can just see in this picture here. Yeah, marram grass, another species that we'll find on our shingle beaches. Brilliant. Another species that will, or should I say, collection of species that we will find on shingle beaches, as well as on strand lines and in salt marshes as well, are our orishes, Atriplex species. Now, a lot of people think that orishes really and goosefoot species, um, it's just too hard to identify them. But I actually think they're quite easy when you get your eye in. Orishes and goosefoot species are generally quite inconspicuous things that are either totally green, totally sort of yellowish, or totally bit red. But as far as plants go, they're quite inconspicuous and they don't have any brightly coloured flowers. They're just these fleshy green, red, or yellowish things. But unlike goosefoot species in the genus Chenopodium, orishes in the genus Atriplex have fruits, have bracteoles here, which are triangular. And in goosefoot species, their fruits are circular. And so orishes are these inconspicuous, fleshy, annual plants that can be green, yellowish, or reddish. But one real key identification feature here is if you look at these fruits, the bracteoles, the leafy bits that encase your seeds, are triangular. And orishes really are a late flowering group, so you find them between June and September. Brilliant. Okay, so on next species, on to P for perennial sow thistle. Perennial sow thistle, another NPMS species for shingle beaches. Our perennial sow thistle, it is a tall rhizomatous plant, so just like our marram, it has a creeping underground rootstock. Perennial plant up to 1.5 meters that we will find inland on disturbed ground, but we will also find it as a preferential plant in places like upper salt marsh and on shingle beaches. Unlike our other sow thistles, though, I think this is a really, really distinctive species, particularly when it's in flower. The leaves themselves are glossy and dark greenish, while the upper parts of the plant, unlike prickly sow thistle, unlike smooth sow thistle, have lots of these little yellow, if you can see my mouse on the screen, lots and lots of little yellow glandular hairs. They're like little hairs tipped with a little circle, with a little sphere. And that is really characteristic for this species, having lots and lots of those yellow glandular hairs in the upper part of the plant. Perennial sow thistle, another species that we'll often find on our vegetated shingle beaches. Brilliant. So we've had a couple of our yellow Asteraceae today. We've had our bristly oxtongue. We've had our perennial sow thistle, and I think this is another, well, it is another one, but this is a really distinctive one, I think, which is prickly lettuce, a close relative of regular lettuce, Lactuca cereola. And this is a plant which is a tall, erect, annual or biennial, so it's not a perennial like a perennial sow thistle. It doesn't have a creeping rootstock, it's not rhizomatous. And prickly lettuce is a plant of sparsely vegetated places, including shingle beaches, generally an olive grey um, colour when it comes to leaves and stems. And if we take a look underneath leaves at the midrib, really beautiful picture here by Moira. You can see it's really prickly on the underside of those midribs. The inflorescences, so the flower heads, the collections of flower heads, are very, very branched in this species. And unlike prickly sow thistle, which may just have a few little individual flowers or flowering heads per inflorescence, prickly lettuce has a hell of a lot, has lots and lots of flower heads within an inflorescence here, which we can see in this top left picture. So, yeah, really interesting little tall, erect, so upright, annual or biennial, which is olive grey. It's got those prickles to your midribs beneath leaves, and the inflorescences are very, very branched with lots of individual flower heads, which make them up. Brilliant. Okay. Our next one is a really, really interesting. I mean, I think they're all interesting, but this is a really interesting species again, which is rock samphire, Crythmum maritimum, a real coastal specialist. Um, and Crythmum maritimum rock samphire is a plant really of coastal vegetated shingle, occasionally sand dune, and also maritime cliffs. This is a glabrous or hairless, creeping perennial of coastal places where there is a low availability of fresh water. And so just like our sea beet, just like our biting stonecrop, this is a succulent plant. The leaves are succulent. And this is a species that again is adapted to retain a lot of water and minimize water loss. A couple of key characters about this species is not only are the leaves succulent, they're really quite divided into linear lobes. So you've got lots of little linear lobes which make up the leaf, which you can see in this bottom left picture. If you fancy crushing them, some people say they smell like things like furniture polish, but I think they just smell really aromatic and quite nice, actually. Maybe I've just been sniffing too much furniture polish, or not enough. But yeah, really interesting little plant that is succulent and aromatic when crushed. Um, when it comes to the flowers as well, flowers are produced in these umbels, these umbrella-like flowering heads like many of our carrot family plants, which this is a part of. However, unlike most of our carrot family plants, which have white flowering heads, our rock samphire has yellowish or greeny flowering heads. Really interesting little coastal specialist. Quite a late flower between June and August. Magic. We've covered a few fairly inconspicuous plants that you'll find on coastal shingle today. We've covered things like sea beet, things like orishes, which are absolutely not very showy at all. But this, our next plant, is a species that is very, very showy indeed, which is sea campion, Silene uniflora. And this is a really showy, small prostate, or so we've had plants that grow as erect. Prostrate is the opposite, so it grows downwards generally. It's a small prostrate perennial plant which forms cushions on rocky shores, occasionally on sand dunes, on maritime cliffs, and of course on shingle beaches. Leaves themselves are glabrous, so they're hairless. They're a little bit glaucous. A couple of similar sounding words. Glabrous means hairless, for those who don't know, and glaucous means they've got a bluey tinge or a greyish tinge to them. So you've got this bluey grey green colour. The flowers themselves are white. They have white corollas or petals, which sit within an inflated calyx tube. So your corolla, that includes your petals, your calyx. It's just a fancy way of saying your sepals or collection of sepals. And in sea campion, all of our sepals are fused together into these tubes, our calyx tubes, which are a little bit veiny and green and sort of reddish colours. And our inflated calyx tubes are what our big old white flowers sit within. Brilliant little plant, sea campion, flowers between June and August. Okay, brilliant. A related species in the same family, but less showy by a long shot, is sea sandwort on Kenya Peploides. Like a lot of these plants, which have, of course, adapted to a hostile environment with low freshwater availability. We've got another succulent species, which is sea sandwort. And this is a small, succulent and creeping perennial, shingle beaches, as well as drift lines on sandy shores. So the areas just above that mean high water mark. Like our sea campion, we've got leaves here in opposite pairs, which are hairless. They're glabrous. And they also occur quite densely, really close together on stems. Flowers are really quite small and whitish green. They have these tiny little 5 whitish petals and 5 greeny yellow sepals. This is another plant of our shingle beaches, which has quite a broad flowering season between May and August. Magic. Okay, a really, really distinctive species of shingle beaches, or probably even our most distinctive one, maybe second most distinctive species of shingle beaches is our sea kale. Really beautiful member of our cabbage family. I was once pointing out plants on a beach, I mentioned that a particular plant was in the cabbage family, and someone said, "What are cabbages doing, growing on beaches?" Well, there are a lot of cabbage family plants that grow on our beaches. This, I think, being our most distinctive on shingle beaches. Sea kale is a large, really large, tufted perennial of shingle beaches with these huge, fleshy and crinkled leaves. It's like fleshy, it's like kale that you buy in the supermarket, but much, much more robust, much fleshier. Early on in the year, though, with sea kale, what you will see is something like this in the bottom left picture. Small leaves that are full of anthocyanins. Anthocyanins, those reddish purpley pigments. Leaves look quite purpley. And then later in the year, as plants grow, they become more glaucous, so that greyish bluey colour, and they lose a lot of those reddish pigments. Um, Brilliant. So a huge plant big plant of shingle beaches with large, fleshy, crinkly leaves. When it's in flower, it has massive collections of small, four-petaled white flowers. And just like our curled dock, which has an adaptation to enable it to be dispersed by the sea, so does sea kale. It protects its seeds after it's flowered with these huge flowering heads of lots of small white flowers. It protects its seeds with really thick corky capsules that can survive at sea. They can not only float at sea, just like our curled dock, but they can survive at sea for several years at a time. A real specialist and a late flowerer as well as our sea kale. Brilliant. We're nearing the end now, so last few species. And our next one is another, I think, maybe less impressive than our sea kale, but certainly quite distinctive as a species, which is silverweed. It's a low-growing stoloniferous perennial. Stoloniferous meaning that there are stolons, they're trailing stems above ground, unlike in rhizomatous species, which have a creeping rootstock. Brilliant. And silverweed, so it's a low-growing stoloniferous perennial of a range of habitats, including waste places, as well as upper salt marsh and shingle beaches. The leaves themselves are pinnate, so they're divided into segments. Um, and most noticeably about the leaves, especially on the undersides of the leaves, is they're coated in small, silky, silver hairs, which is where this plant gets its name from. So you can see in this another beautiful picture by Moira, these small silvery hairs coating the underside of this leaf here. When it's in flower, the flowers are yellow, 5-petaled, and they come from little axils of those stolons. Beautiful, albeit widespread species that we will find again on our shingle beaches. Woody nightshade, just like silverweed, is a widespread species, but on shingle beaches, woody nightshade you will find is a little bit different to woody nightshade you'll find inland or in other habitats. And that's because var maritimum, variety maritimum, the kind of woody nightshade we'll find on shingle beaches, is adapted to become succulent. It's adapted to that lack, that scarcity of fresh water within the habitat, and it's become succulent. So that means that, of course, it's more tolerant to desiccation and summer heat, especially when there's even lower availability of fresh water. So this is a procumbent or downright woody perennial found in a range of habitats. The Varmaritimum is the kind you'll find on shingle beaches. When it's in flower, it'll generally have purple or very occasionally white petals, which give rise to fruits which are bright red and full of alkaloids that are toxic to us. So as delectable as they might look, of course, don't be going and eating anything from your woody nightshade. Brilliant. I think this is our last species, which I think is another seriously, just like our sea kale, seriously distinctive species that we'll find on our shingle beaches, a serious specialist, which is our yellow-horned poppy, Glaucium flavum. And yellow-horned poppy is a really glaucous, short-lived perennial. Glaucous, you can really see it in this picture here. It's a greyish bluey colour. Greyish bluey coloured plant. Plants also lower leaves, which you can again see in this main picture, which are really, really dissected, really deeply lobed, and they're quite hairy as well. But what happens when yellowhorn poppy forms flowering stems is those leaves that go up the stems become less and less loby, less indented, and also less hairy, which is another character for this species. Flowers are very, very bright and bold. They're a bright yellow, they're 4-petaled. And what we can see in the middle of this flower is what eventually will become the capsule, the seed capsule. And what happens with yellow-horned poppy is when it loses its petals, this little developing seed capsule elongates massively. And you can see a few of these capsules. They just look like someone snapped off the flowers and it's a long bit of stem. But actually, these, where my mouse is circling now, these are the developing capsules, these long horns, if you like, of the yellow-horned poppy. This is a summer to autumn flower, so June to September. So this beautiful species flowers. Brilliant. So, today we have covered quite a lot. We've covered what shingle beaches are. We've covered that they are hostile environments that are full of specialists. We've covered the fact that they aren't just special habitats, they are themselves very variable and they offer us ecosystem services like coastal sea defence. We've also covered that they are globally rare habitats in desperate need of conservation action. And we've also covered just how globally rare they are and how much shingle beaches, vegetated shingle beaches, Britain has in a global context. We have about 1/3 of all vegetated shingle in Europe. So a real global stronghold for a globally rare habitat. And of course, overall, we found out that shingle beaches, hopefully, are amazing habitats if you didn't know already. So I think I think we're at the 45-ish minute mark. So I think, yeah, covered quite a bit today. So I'll open up to questions. Thank you very much. Cool.
Thank you so much, Josh. That is impeccably timed. Obviously, super pro. So we've got a couple of questions actually. One really interesting one I've had through in the chat that says, would you define coastal vegetated shingle from the substrate or from the vegetation? And there's a bit of a backstory to this. This is uh, referencing some old shingle ridges in northeast Scotland that are such a long way from the sea, and they're not really impacted by the sea necessarily having an influence, and they don't have any classic shingle species. But of course, when looking at the substrate itself, they are defined as shingle. The only real vegetation spotted is gorse. So yes, would you look at vegetation or the substrate?
I think the substrate is a key thing there and how it's arisen. So I think one thing about shingle beaches is, as we were talking about in the early days of all these slides, it is an immensely variable habitat. And what happens over time, just like sand dunes, just like salt marsh, is as the habitat gets older, it changes. So we'll start off with our pioneer vegetation, which becomes more stable, and you'll get things like sea kale, yeah, yellowhorn poppy, and all kinds of other things. But with shingle beaches, it doesn't stop there. A lot of the time, as time goes on, the habitat becomes more acidic, especially if there's sand intermixed in with that shingle. And you might get that vegetated shingle going more towards a heathland. You might get scrub on it, you might get gorse on it, might get blackthorn, hawthorn on it. You might get a holly woodland dominated by holly persist there. But all of that ultimately is still vegetated shingle. So yeah,
Of course.
yeah,
Thank
really
you.
variable.
Hugely variable. And of course, we've got a few comments in the chat mentioning other quite common species, vipers bug loss, excuse me, red valerium, which don't actually feature on the NPMS indicator list, but of course can be seen. And someone else has actually asked to comment if you could comment on some invasive species that perhaps can threaten this habitat type.
Yeah, I mean, there's so in legal terms, so species that might be included under Schedule 9 of your Wildlife Countryside Act as one example. You could have things like Japanese knotweed, that come in on vegetated shingle and can be a risk to sort of these habitats. Species that aren't necessarily included as sort of invasive species under things like Schedule 9 might be things like red valerian, which can be a serious problem on shingle beaches. So yeah, those are a couple I know. Yeah, yeah.
And I just found one in the Q&A as well here that asks, would you classify driftline vegetation on shingle? So, for example, a narrow strip as the coastal vegetated shingle habitat. So, essentially, is it pioneer vegetated shingle or perhaps a separate habitat?
So it's all included under the same
Yeah.
banner, really.
Okay.
Just like, so if we think about sand dunes, where we have a lot more categories, if you like, we've got embryo sand dune, we've got mobile dune, we've got semi-fixed dune, we've got fixed dune, we've got dune slack, got dune heath. But ultimately, all of these categories, they're part of that same habitat, coastal sand dune, and it's the same with coastal vegetated shingle. So if we've got an area of heath on shingle that's really old, that's coastal vegetated shingle, but so is your pioneer vegetation.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah.
Some lovely examples that people have given now make me quite jealous and wanting to go out and find some vegetated shingle. A lovely example from Sidmouth in Devon, which has part of its shingle beach fronting the esplanade. Oh, it just jumped. Hang on a moment. Here we go. Reserved for shingle specialist plants, and it's actually maintained by volunteers, but supported by the local council. So that's what you like to hear, isn't it?
Oh,
And you
nice.
can
Yeah.
tick off nearly all of the species mentioned so far. Oh, that's fantastic. And actually, Ed, you've also asked how many of the monitored squares might be expected to have shingle beach populations. It's actually quite a small proportion, especially unsurprising, I suppose, looking at the map that Joshua showed us at the very beginning there, and because sometimes they can be a little bit harder to access. There's some sort of additional accessibility problems. So it is a relatively small proportion of the NPMS um, monitored squares. However, even with that in mind, they still are underrepresented for how many we would expect. So that's something to mention. Um, Last question, I think, just because I can see it's 28 minutes past one. My golly, we could talk about it all day. Is there such thing as freshwater shingle vegetation?
Ooh. Um, well, whether you call it that is one question, but there are shingle beaches where actually you get aquifers within them through the vegetation. So that is an immensely rare occurrence, but you can find sort of vegetated shingle where you do get that. Um, yeah, yeah.
Oh, how interesting. That's absolutely fantastic. And I'm getting now mostly lots of thanks now in the chat, Joshua, for an absolutely fantastic presentation. I think your enthusiasm really shines through, and I think we're all feeling rather inspired. Um, so because we only have now 30 seconds, I did just want to repeat that if you joined us a little bit later or you want to go back and reference this another time, I will be in due course. I don't know if I'm quite going to get a chance to do so today, but I will pop this up on the NPMS YouTube channel for you to take a look at a later date. And the last thing to say is, again, a huge thank you to Joshua and, of course, everybody for joining us on your lunch break or over your lunchtime. But yes, thank you so much, Josh, for your time and for putting in all
No,
of that
thank
effort
you.
into a fantastic presentation.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks very much.
It's been
Cool.
absolutely great. And I should say as well, if you do get a chance, a quick chance before I shut it to have a little look at the chat, Josh, you'll see some of those lovely thanks and an idea of where everybody's joining us from today. We've got folk from all over today that have joined us. So thank you, everybody. Um, Keep warm. I know it's getting pretty chilly now, and have a lovely rest of your week.
Cool.